is the Human Vicegerency Bad Theology in the Anthropocene. All right, so there's a lot of interconnections with other papers, but it'll be a little bit of a different take, as always is the case, and I'm glad for that. The director for the Center of Sustainable Development at Columbia University, New York, Jeffrey Sachs, was, among other influential positions, special advisor to 3 general secretaries to the United Nations, from 2001 to 2018. He's currently the SDG advocate to Antonio Guterres. In his 2015 book, The Age of Sustainable Development is considered the most influential blueprint for the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by all nations that year. In his preface, Sachs declares that we live in the Anthropocene, the human-made new era, or the unprecedented epoch of the Earth in which the Earth's physical change, climate, biodiversity, chemistry, is mainly driven by human activity. And then in his first chapter, he summarizes some of the changes humanity has forced upon our planet Earth. And I quote, "Humanity is changing Earth's climate, the availability of fresh water, the ocean's chemistry, and the inhabitants of other species. These impacts are so large that Earth itself is undergoing unmistakable changes in the functioning of key processes, such as the cycles of water, nitrogen, and carbon, upon which life depends. We don't know the precise scaling, timing, or implications of these changes, but we do understand enough to know that these are extremely dangerous and unprecedented in the span of humanity's 10,000 years of civilization. These changes are massive indeed, and they have come with brutal speed compared to changes in the Earth's past. Though the term Anthropocene is not yet the official label for our current geological era, it helpfully expresses the scientific consensus that we humans have badly damaged our God-given environment. And unless we change course rather drastically, we may well join other species that have already gone extinct. That is why at least 5 of the 17 SDGs, which take aim at 2030, as you know, target either our human adaptation to these new realities or seek to mitigate the worst trends like climate change. For example, SDG 11, anyway, you know all these things. So anyway, there are 5 of them, besides the obvious one, climate action. You have life below water and life on land, 14 and 15, among others. But I bring all this up as an example of humanity coming together in an unprecedented way to solve the problem of poverty. That's SDG 1, and the myriad challenges in our environment that need urgent fixing. This would spell good news if indeed current wars could be stopped, if tensions between the great powers don't escalate into much greater conflicts with the prospect of nuclear warfare, and finally, if the United Nations still manages to keep us working together. To be honest, we humans are teetering on the edge of the abyss. And this is precisely where we should insert the Quranic and biblical teaching about the vicegerency of humanity, or the dominion, trusteeship, stewardship of the earth God gave to his human creatures at creation. And we've heard a lot about this already today. So there's the power, the Creator putting us in charge, but also responsibility and accountability on the day of judgment. And much sooner than that, we are already paying a hefty price for our greed and unbridled exploitation of the earth's precious resources. And as we also know, it is the poor, the world's poor, who are paying the highest price. So in this paper, I want to question this caliphate of humanity. It's clearly stated in the sacred texts of the Abrahamic faiths, but is it still relevant? Or perhaps have our modern eyes and minds clouded our interpretation of it? My first point here will be to say that, indeed, the latter is the case, and that other texts point to a different paradigm, and therefore we have to reconsider our relationship with nature or the rest of creation. We also need to learn from our indigenous brothers and sisters. Finally, I will circle back to the SDGs and try to show that beyond all the good we can do for our environment in our respective communities, and we've talked about taking all these concepts into practical application, and I have to admit that I'm not the best at that, although I am part of well, it's not directly, but everything is interrelated. But I'm part of the Fair Trade Committee here in Media, Pennsylvania, America's first fair trade town. And it started in the UK. So, you know, Congratulations to you all there. All right, so we all need to learn from our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and we all can work together to make this happen. So the first point is the modern hijacking of the human vicegerency. When it comes to the trusteeship, our vicegerency of humanity, as laid out in the Quran and Bible, I have some skin in the game, as you know, that 2010 book, Earth, Empire, and Sacred Texts, Muslims and Christians as Trustees of Creation. But if you look at the title, actually, there's very little about Earth in there and much more about empire and sacred text. I was more interested in hermeneutics and the misuse of political power, namely empires, colonialism, and the like. I devoted 133 pages to my scanning the major Quranic commentaries, the tafsir tradition, and seeing how verse 30 and following of Surah Al-Baqarah was interpreted in various periods of history. What stands out is a wide spectrum of Muslim thought in the last century or so. It sees this concept of Khilafat Allah as demonstrating God's empowerment of humanity over the rest of creation, on the one hand, and God's command to humankind to manage the Earth's resources in a responsible and equitable fashion. And then many others see it too as an affirmation of the inherent worth of all human beings on an equal plane, underpinning the values of democracy and human rights. And Farhana Meyer, who is here with us, in her excellent book comparing and bringing together Islamic views of creation and the environment with those of Pope Francis in his encyclical Laudato Si, draws from Sufi traditions and in particular from Osman Bakr, whom I met in a conference a while ago, and saying the following: but the human being, divine deputy on earth, made of earthly matter, is a uniting of divine spirit, intellect combined with moral character and physical earth. The human connects these different dimensions and elements in a way that angels do not, since angels do not contain within themselves physical matter. It is because humankind is made in the total image of God that humanity is the vicegerent, Khalifa on earth, whose purpose is to reflect God in a total way in the world. So there's nothing problematic here in this fine-tuned Quranic theology of humanity. And then if you add her emphasis on nature or creation as infused with God's signs, ayat, and spirit, ruh, there is a call here to treat with love and respect this book of creation. In this light, how could we, quote, continue to desecrate this incredible and intricate, exquisite and thought-provoking, challenging and life-fulfilling book? Unfortunately, the story of European civilization already in the Renaissance period was about a new focus on the human being and his mastery of nature. I will be following the thoughts of Jürgen Moltmann, one of the greatest Protestant theologians of the last century, yet still writing now in his 90s. His 2019 book, The Spirit of Hope, Theology in a World of Peril, is very relevant to our reflection here. He quotes the Renaissance writer Pico della Mirandola, who in his 1486 discourse on the dignity of the human being has God saying to humanity, I have set you in the center of the world, so that as your own, completely free and honorably acting sculptor and poet, you yourself may determine the form in which you wish to live. Because they are in the image of the Creator and because the world runs by laws humans can discover and use to their advantage, modern people see themselves the measure of all things, the inventor of their own selves, the lords of their own world. This is reminiscent of Surah Al-Alaq in the Quran, saying, but man exceeds all bounds when he thinks he is self-sufficient. You might call this unhinged hubris, and there is but a small step from here to saying, I don't need God, or even, there is no God. What is more, this kind of arrogance easily leads to a sense of entitlement, to trampling on weaker people for one's own gain. Francis Bacon declared, knowledge is power, and unsurprisingly, this was also the beginning of the colonial age, accompanied by the massive genocide of the American indigenous population. Such power discrepancies can often lead to abuse and much worse. Moltmann says no, knowledge should lead to wisdom. Yet according to the worldview of the Church Fathers, the human person was also a hypostasis of the whole cosmic nature. So yes, you have this human being is God's deputy and representative on earth, but also in today's ecological discourse, it would be a microcosm in which all previous life forms are integrated. That is why Moltmann is calling us to cosmic humility, and he explains. Before we human beings till and keep the earth, that's Genesis 2, and assume any rule over the world or any responsibility for creation, the earth cares for us. It creates the conditions that are favorable for the human race and has preserved it down to the present day. It's not that the earth is entrusted to us. We are entrusted to the earth. The earth can live without us human beings, but we cannot live without the earth. Both Quran and Bible teach that man was formed out of the dust of the earth and that it was God's breath breathed in him that made him a living person. Moltmann, however, goes a step further. On the basis of Psalm 104, he asserts that God breathed into all of his creatures. In verse 24, the psalmist exclaims, "Oh Lord, what a variety of things you have made. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures." And he mentions how God feeds them and they are all richly satisfied. Then this passage, "But if you turn away from them, they panic. When you take away their breath, they die and turn again to dust. When you give them your breath, life is created and you renew the face of the earth." Moltmann reasons here that if humankind's creation in the image of God is tied to his spirit, ruh in Arabic, ruach in Hebrew, and in both cases meaning both spirit or breath, wind, quote, "then all created things in which God's spirit dwells are God's image and must be respected accordingly." Then, following the Apostle Paul in Romans 8, he notes that we humans share with all other creatures the same suffering and the same hope for redemption. In Paul's words, "But with eager hope, the creation looks forward to the day when it will join God's children in glorious freedom from death and decay." And then, as Moltmann puts it, "Men and women will not be redeemed from transience and death from this earth, but together with the earth." If we are to survive as a human race, he argues, we will have to find our place in the community of fellow human beings and respectfully consider any intervention in nature. True knowledge is not power, he concludes, but wisdom. That wisdom has been in short supply in the modern period, to say the least. And I'll skip some of this because we've touched on a lot. Now, learning from indigenous wisdom. Theologian George E. Tinker, his mother was from a family of Norwegian immigrants, but his father was a citizen of the Osage Nation. And it was his indigenous heritage that he mostly clung to growing up. After teaching 32 years at the United Methodist Phillips Theological School in Denver, Colorado, Tinker retired in 2017, but still does some teaching there and speaking in different venues around the world. But he has always been he has been active in Native American circles. He served many years in the Leadership Council of the American Indian Movement of Colorado and founded and directed the Four Winds Indian Council in Denver. As a theologian, he also had to be an anthropologist and historian in order to sort out the struggles and dysfunctions of his fellow Native Americans, both in the church and outside of it. This is the poorest segment of the United States population, and its life expectancy is about 18 years below that of the white population. Just think about that. In his book, American Indian Liberation, A Theology of Sovereignty, Tinker has concluded that there are four fundamental, deep structure, cultural differences between Indian people and the cultures that derive from European traditions. And these nicely summarize some of the wisdom we can glean from these people. First, indigenous traditions are spatially rooted as opposed to Western ones, which are temporally rooted. Their identity revolves much more around their land than their history. In Western culture, history and temporality reign supreme, and people's goal is progress and time is money. But Native people prioritize spatial rather than temporal thinking. A second pillar of American Indian, Alaska Natives, and all other indigenous populations is that whereas Euro-Westerners prioritize the individual or his or her rights, they are communitarian by nature. For them, he explains, spiritual involvement in the ceremonial life of a community is typically engaged in for the sake of the people and not for the sake of personal salvation or spiritual self-empowerment. A third pillar of indigenous worldview is quote, a firm sense of group filial attachment to particular places that comes with the responsibility to relate to the land in those places with responsibility. Well, I already said that, responsibility. That's why, for instance, the Trail of Tears is such a traumatic event for many Native Americans. About 60,000 were forcefully displaced, and many did not survive the long trek from southeastern United States to, quote, Indian lands beyond the Mississippi in the 1830s. A deeper reason for this attachment of land can be found in a fourth worldview pillar, and that is that everything in nature or creation is intimately related. And we've heard some of this in other papers today, but this is particularly an indigenous kind of approach to our world and our life, as opposed to Euro-Westerners who see themselves as distinct from and above the natural world and its living beings. Indigenous people live and experience themselves as part of creation, he says. And he says that their wider community includes, quote, animals, four-legged, birds, all the living, moving things, including rocks, hills, trees, rivers, and so on, along with all the other sorts of two-legged, example, bears, humans of different colors in the world. What is this most precious gift, he says, American Indians can share with their fellow Americans? Tinker answers, it's our perspective on the interrelatedness of all creation and our deep sense of relationship to the land in particular, just as there is no category of the inanimate. There can be no conception of anything in the created world that does not share in the sacredness infused in the act of creation. Creation is the theological bedrock of indigenous communities, and the circle is the commanding metaphor, as seen particularly in their community prayers. They most often pray in large circles. The circle encompasses the tribe's connection to other tribes and to all humans, and then to all the universe and creation. In this worldview, hierarchy is absent. Chiefs are chosen by consensus, and they are expected to embody the collective will of the tribe. This is an egalitarian worldview that applies not only to other people, but to their animal relatives and all the physical elements of the physical world created by God, or the Great Spirit, or some other similar concept depending on the tribe. There is also the idea of established boundaries for the balance and harmony of creation to be maintained. Thus, if a tribe must cut down a tree to build a sweat lodge, for example, it will engage in a ceremony with some kind of sacrifice and prayers that symbolically apologize for this violence. The same goes for hunting. Often prayers need to be spoken or sung, even words of respect spoken to the animal about to be sacrificed. One of the main objectives of Tinker's book, however, is to establish that Christian theology should not start with Christ and his redemption, but like the early creeds, it should begin with creation. This theological priority of creation, he contends, is not a priority for environmental concern, but rather a firm foundation for justice and a vision for peace. By confessing God as creator and ourselves as created, there is hope for spiritual transformation that can bring us closer to the basileia of God, the kingdom of God in our midst, Luke 17:21. This can lead us to repentance for the ways we have disrupted the harmony and balance of creation. Confession precedes return, he writes. This is the condition for, quote, living in balance with God in all creation. So Tinker's agenda is much wider than just environmental concerns. And from that, we can learn from indigenous people who have been so badly beaten down by settler communities, and also, frankly, by majorities of voters whose concerns clash with the needs of the poorest in their midst. And that is that the harmony and balance of creation includes a striving for greater peace and justice. So at the end of his second chapter, Creation, Justice, and Peace, Tinker states, yes, Indian peoples have experienced and continue to experience endless oppression as a result of what some would call the barbaric invasion of America. In that vein, he continues, moreover, we suspect that the greed that motivated the displacement of all indigenous peoples from their lands and spiritual rootedness is the same greed that threatens the destruction of the earth and the continued oppression of so many peoples, and ultimately the destruction of our white relatives. whatever is the stories the settlers tell or the theologies that develop to interpret those stories, something seems wrong to Indian people. But not only do Indians continue to tell stories, sing the songs, speak the prayers, and perform the ceremonies that root themselves deeply in Mother Earth, they are actually audacious enough to think that their stories and their ways of reverencing creation will someday win over our white settler relatives and transform them. Tinker then ends this chapter with a prayer: may justice, followed by genuine peace, flow out of concern for one another and all creation. So, coming out of this, let's name it for what it is: the modern Western interpretation of the Islamic Christian tenet of human dominion over creation is simply bad theology. The Bible agrees with the Quranic verse, which has to say, we have honored the children of Adam and carried them by land and sea. We have provided good sustenance for them and favored them especially above those we have created. And in Genesis 1, Psalm 8, and many other places, we find the same sentiments. But let me just say here, speaking of hermeneutics, theology is always formulated in context. And there is, first of all, the context of Scripture itself. Quran consistently reminds its readers and hearers of the danger of human arrogance and temptation to live without God's guidance and help. The rich often misuse their power to crush the poor and powerless. The scriptures castigate political leaders like Pharaoh for trampling on the rights of their people and waging brutal wars of conquest in other nations, and the same could be said of the Bible. But the other context worth interrogating here is the historical one. What the socioeconomic and political dynamics are at play, which ones are at play at the time. I was co-guest editor of the 2012 issue of the journal Worldviews, Global Religions, Culture, and Ecology on Islam and Ecology, and my own article was about the role of Sharia in current Muslim debates on ecology. And while researching that piece, I discovered that Sayyid Hossein Nasr, we heard about earlier today, gave a series of lectures on Islam and ecology in the University of Chicago in 1967, just months before that famous publication of Lynn White's article laying the blame of the ecological crisis at the feet of the monotheistic faiths and Christianity in particular. But having said that, Nasr never really dealt with the practical aspect of how this crisis might be solved. That said, White's piece sparked a good deal of soul-searching among Christian theologians, and the idea of the dominion of humankind over nature would undergo yet another interpretation in parallel with the growing environmental movement and the discoveries of more and more grievous havoc we have wreaked on our land, sea, air, ozone, and climate. The tide was turning, and people started approaching the sacred text from a different angle. The landmark international response to this crisis was the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, or the United Nations Conference on the Environment and Development, that set into motion a global agenda that eventually led to the formulation of the 2000 Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, and the 2015 SDGs. It also spawned a 5-year international effort to draft the Earth Charter, which came out in 2000. In the preamble of which we read that in the midst of a magnificent diversity of cultures and life forms, we are one human family and one Earth community with one destiny. And then it presented an agenda that brought together social justice and environmental care in a seamless way. I read, we must join together to bring forth a sustainable global society founded on respect for nature, universal human rights, economic justice, and a culture of peace. Towards this end, it is imperative that we, the people of Earth, declare our responsibility to one another, to the greater community of life, and to future generations. Now we're seeing this interconnectedness here, much more holistic. And this is the kind of language Tinker was using. It may not be surprising, as there had already been much discussion in UN circles on how to integrate the needs, aspirations, and contributions of the indigenous peoples of the world. This movement culminated in a document adopted by the UN General Assembly in September 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Though certainly much work remains to be done, we cannot but applaud this kind of progress in the global arena. Finally, growing out of the Earth Summit at Rio In 1992, the United Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, came 2 years later, ratified by 198 countries. This kickstarted the yearly conference of the parties, the COPs, where government-level large-scale gatherings attract large numbers of, quote, industry leaders, youth activists, representatives of indigenous communities, journalists, and other stakeholders. This past year's COP28 conference in Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, was the biggest COP yet, with 85,000 participants, including more than 150 heads of state and government, the representatives of national delegations, civil society, business, indigenous peoples, youth, philanthropy, and international organizations. So how does this relate to Muslims and Christians working to heal our planet? Well, at the highest levels of leadership, since COP26, there has been a global faith leaders summit just preceding the actual, well, sometimes inside during the COP conference, because it lasts about 10 days or so, more than that, about 2 weeks. Anyway, I'm going to skip some of this, but let me just come to yeah. Wait, I got my pages mixed up. Here we go. Abu Dhabi Interfaith Statement for COP28 was prepared by faith leaders over several months before the gathering was signed in Abu Dhabi by 28 faith leaders. The signatories, identified in the document as representatives of diverse faiths and indigenous traditions, coming together to declare shared concern for the escalating climate impacts that imperil our cherished planet, as well as our common commitment to jointly address the global crisis. Also, for the first time, the presidency, with the MCE and United Nations Environment Program, hosted the Faith Pavilion for the first time this past year. And this Faith Pavilion hosts panels with religious leaders, scientists, and political leaders, as well as encourages intergenerational dialogue with young faith leaders and indigenous representatives. So let me just say that the Faith Pavilion itself is set up to engage a spectrum of activists. Think about it. This is an opportunity for local groups of Muslims and Christians, and here I'm trying to apply this a little bit more, who are already collaborating, hopefully, in their own communities to fund and send representatives who will participate and return with greater knowledge and motivation. That would be something worth aiming for. I have no time to comment any more on the already considerable engagement of people of faith individually and hundreds of FBOs, so faith-based organizations, in various aspects of this global push to reach the SDGs. It's a good start, but let's do more. So I'm encouraging us to think about global governance and ways that people of faith, Christians, Muslims, and others, are able to participate and hopefully set an example here. Not that we aren't behind, as we heard about the paper of religious, religious people from various faith traditions and how that might or might not impact their voting for environmental issues. There's plenty of people, in fact, people without faith, perhaps are even more involved, but we can change that. We should change that, particularly when we think about Tinker's Circle and how it stands for the egalitarian worldview of native populations and the interrelatedness of all creation, all living beings and all elements of their physical environment. All is sacred and precious in a spiritual sense. And this we can agree on, coming from many different traditions, religious traditions. And we can find ways to get involved in more global matters with faith-based or secular NGOs that work on a variety of areas so that poverty will recede, greater equity and justice will spread where needed most, good governance will be strengthened, and where nature will revive and regenerate. And may we who choose to trust the Creator and follow his call through the power of his Spirit to demonstrate for all genuine humility in carrying out our divine trusteeship, always bearing in mind the symbols of the circle and web we have learned from our indigenous brothers and sisters who have always lived closer to the earth. Thank you.